Begin as we should all things in life. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
A number of years back, I read a story about a man named Nan-in. Nan-in was a Zen Buddhist who worked at a university in Japan. One day, he was in his office, and he was visited by one of the university professors who came to inquire about Zen. Nan-in invited the man in and started asking questions about his life and his beliefs. After about an hour of discussion, Nan-in rose to serve tea. He poured the professor's cup full and then kept pouring. The professor watched in amazement as the tea overflowed the cup until he could no longer restrain himself. And he said, "The cup is overflowing. No more will go in." At that, Nan-in looked into the eyes of the man and said, "Like this cup, you are full with your pride, your opinions, and your speculations. You came here to inquire about Zen, but how can I show you Zen unless you first empty your cup?" Today's gospel, Jesus encounters a group of people who are like Nan-in's visitor. Their cups are full, and they need to be emptied if they're ever to receive his message. Jesus is in Galilee, yet some of the Pharisees and scribes had made the long trip from Jerusalem to see him. Do you think they come to listen as he teaches about living a better life? Do you think they come to receive some word or hope to guide them? No. They come to find fault. They come to expose Jesus. They come to show their superiority and challenge Jesus in front of the crowd that is following him. But on this day, they choose not to confront Jesus directly. They choose rather to find fault with his disciples. What they criticize is not a huge moral failing or a huge spiritual failing. Rather, it is a custom of human origin, a pious custom. They notice that certain disciples of Jesus are eating with unwashed hands, and this scandalizes them. The hand washing in question is not a hygienic measure. Rather, it is ritualistic. So the Pharisees and the scribes come to Jesus and question him, saying, "Why do your disciples not follow the tradition of the elders, but instead eat a meal with unclean hands?" Now Jesus recognizes them for who they are and what they are about. And he recognizes that their cups are full of their own opinions and speculations. They have come to find fault, and they have no room left for anything else. Jesus recognizes these men for who they are, and in their challenge he sees a great spiritual danger that can threaten any one of us. And so Jesus responds by calling the people following him together. And he says, "Listen, listen." And then he quotes from the prophet Isaiah. Let's read that again. Here's what he said. "This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines." What Jesus is telling the crowd that day, and what he is telling you and I, is that to simply look out. Purity is not a matter of keeping external rules without regard to what's inside of you. Righteousness is not simply how you behave when people are watching. It is what you have in your heart. Today, Jesus is telling us to pay attention to what's in our heart. The heart that we are talking about is not the muscle in our chest that pumps blood, but rather It is the very core of our being. It is who we are. It is our inner self. Jesus tells us today that it is the heart, our inner self, that matters. If we fill ourselves with the superfluous and meaningless things of this world, our hearts will become full with things that don't matter. And we have no room for Christ. If our hearts overflow with our opinions and our speculations, we have no room for the truth. If our hearts overflow with avarice and hurt and bitterness, we have no room for Jesus. Today, we are called to empty ourselves, to rid ourselves of the meaningless things of this world, and to open ourselves to Jesus Christ. To open our hearts to his truth, to put aside what defiles us, and to open our hearts to the grace and the love of God. My brothers and sisters, we live in a consumer society that tells us that bombards us with messages about how consumption can solve all of our problems. But consumption cannot solve the problem that Jesus exposes. What we require at the very center of our being is for God to create a new heart, a heart full of his love, a heart made for service. Our hearts need to be emptied, not just once, but over and over again, to remove the influences of the world and to make room for Christ. Our focus needs to be on our inner being, for as Jesus tells us today, nothing that enters from the outside can defile, but the things that come from within is what defiles. What that means is that God is interested in good hearts, not good habits. He's interested in the inside, not the outside. That is the lesson that Jesus is teaching us today, that God knows our inner being. He knows who we are at our core and that where we need to make room for him. And so we can be filled with his transforming grace. Sometimes in life, we fill our hearts with things that don't matter, things of the world that are of little consequence. When we do that, our hearts become full of the unnecessary, leaving no room for Christ. Along with Nanen's university professor, we must be set free from the things of the world, set free from our own opinions, set free from our own judgments and speculations, and become open to the miracle of God's love that is right around us every day. As disciples of Jesus Christ, we are called to live what we believe, not just say it. As disciples of Christ, our lives are to be lived in the faith that comes from within us. Rituals are important, but they cannot define who we are. If pouring of water over the hands to remove dirt reminds us daily that we need to wash our hearts and practice generosity, kindness, faithfulness, humility, and fidelity, then that's a good thing. If, on the other hand, we think that the simple act of pouring water over our hands makes us acceptable before God, then we are sadly mistaken. Jesus today is calling us to real faith, faith that is at the core of our being, faith that goes beyond simple deeds, faith that is lived, not just spoken. Today, we are called to real faith, faith that is lived from our hearts, from deep inside of ourselves. Listen again to the words of St. James. He said, "Be doers of the word, and not merely hearers who deceive themselves." Be doers of the word, and not merely hearers. That's powerful. It's a mission. Faith, like love, requires action. It's not something that we should keep hidden. It is something that we are called to share with the entire world. In faith, each one of us is called to see the good in people, to recognize that Christ is in each one of us, to be an example of hope to a wanting world, to bring the love of God to those who are marginalized, to be an example to everyone that we meet, the power of our faith because of the peace that it brings to us. A question for all of us today is this: are our hearts in our faith, or only our lips? Is our cup full? Do we have things that we need to get rid of? Are we allowing God's grace to work in us, from deep within us, or are we just going through the motions? God calls us today to deeds, not creeds, love rather than law, and hearts of faith over mere words. Today, Jesus is calling us to throw out all the things that don't matter and to open our hearts to Him. Today, He is calling us to live our faith from the very core of our being. That is our call. Jesus is asking, how will you respond? Amen.
Amen.